Greetings, academic proletariat, and welcome to this rendition of Mr. Olson's Fireside Chats, where we will be discussing the 1950s and whether this decade was really, as it has become known, a decade of consensus and conformity. So to kick things off, we're going to introduce a book called The Affluent Society by John Kenneth Galbraith, which is a book that outlines basically how America has risen to affluence in the world. It also is very critical of America and its spot in the world, and critical of the fact that America will pay for bombs but not schools. That's affluence for you. Now, some things that are underlying America's economic prosperity during this time. The GI Bill of Rights, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, that's passed shortly before World War II ends, says that any servicemen that come back from World War II will be allowed entrance into college, and the government will pay for it. Also, the government is going to offer loans for those servicemen to buy houses. So it's very easy for servicemen to get houses when they come back, which is going to lead to a housing boom, which we will see in a second. Because those servicemen need housing and there's not a lot of available housing, there's going to be an increase in construction, which will lead to an economic upturn. There's been a 20-year pent-up of wants and needs that people haven't been buying or taking care of, largely because of the Great Depression, and now since they're going to have money due to a lot of different factors, they're going to start spending it. There's also a lot of Cold War spending going on, which means that there's a lot of money being dumped into technology, a lot of money being provided to jobs, and people will have places to work. There's also a large baby boom that takes place during this time period, and where there are kids, there is money being spent. Take it from me. And then finally, America is very good at what is called planned obsolescence, which means it creates items that are going to go out of style very shortly. I'm sure many of you out there that are listening have either an iPhone 4 or an iPhone 5 and are wishing you had an iPhone 6. Those of you that have an iPhone 6, just wait, your time will come, because an iPhone 7 will come out and you'll be wishing that you have it. Okay, so to start things off, before we talk about the boom, I want to make sure that you have with you a guide that goes with this presentation. It's a chart where you are basically taking notes on what's consensus, what's non-consensus as we go through the decades. So first things first, the baby boom. And if a lot of people are doing it, you can assume that it is consensus. According to a British visitor who came to America in 1958, which is an important year, said, "It seems to me that every other young housewife I see is pregnant," and that was the trend. As you notice in this graph, there's a peak in kids that are born in the 1950s. In 1957, which is the peak of the boom, there is a baby born in America every 7 seconds. Count to 7 and there would be a child born in America. That's intense and a little bit crazy. I want you to keep that year 1957 in the back of your mind for a moment. This is a picture of Dr. Benjamin Spock, who in 1946 wrote a book called Common Sense to Baby and Child Care. It was basically a mother's handbook to raising her kids. It told moms that they know more than they think they know and that they should be confident in raising their kids. He was like the world's pediatrician during the 1950s. He's pictured here with a family of quintuplets. And one extra one in there in the background. You can see him with his mouth open. But anyways, he was the man who basically told women that they could have kids. Now, if you notice, this chart in the bottom right-hand corner is school enrollment. And you notice that school enrollment increases dramatically from the 1950s and on. And if you notice the 1970s, it is very, very high. If you remember, 1957 was the peak of the boom. If you count 14 years from 1957, which would be a year when young people are entering high school, you get 1971, which just so happens to be the first year that Rolling Meadows High School opened. So there's a bit of history for you. In addition to the baby boom, the 1950s also has become known as the decade of the automobile, and really the establishment of a car culture in America. The registrations of cars goes up by 2 times between 1945 and 1960. So by 1960, there's 60 million cars being driven around in America, and these cars were very flashy. As you see, the pink Cadillac pictured here has nice little fins. I don't know that many guys in high school would drive that car around today. It might be a little bit too flashy for them. But cars were a staple in life. I'm sure that if you have grandparents that were alive in the 1950s, they can vouch that cars meant a big deal. And cars were able to be a big deal because the government facilitated the Interstate Highway Act, which was the largest project in American history. It cost $32 billion, which adjusted for inflation is a lot of money. There were 41,000 miles of new highways built. Now, I don't want you to think that these highways were just built because people had cars and they need to get around. The Interstate Highway Act was largely built as a Cold War endeavor to make sure that people were able to move about the country in the event of an attack, which is why when you're traveling on interstates, all overpasses that go over the interstate you're on are high enough for tanks to get through. Here's a map of the interstate highway system. Chances are you've driven on one before. You yourself might have driven on one, and anytime you see one of those signs, you have the government to thank. So one point I want to make right here before we move on is that the Interstate Highway Act allowed people to move to different areas of the country, which we'll talk about in a second, but it also allowed them to move outside of the cities, which we'll come back to in a second. Because of the car, America becomes a more homogenous culture, which means that people start doing the same things because they're able to get to the same places, they're able to follow each other around, and from this you see different corporations and different business chains start to prop up. The first McDonald's, which opens in Des Plaines, Illinois, you can visit it and get a postcard for your AP US history teacher if you'd like, opened in 1955. It was started by a guy named Ray Kroc, who saw the idea in California, brought it to Illinois, and opened it up. Howard Johnson's, which is a hotel chain, started to open up along interstates, gave people a place to stay if they were out and about and traveling. And then the infamous drive-in movies, where kids would go park their cars and hopefully watch a movie. The car also led to the advent of places like Disneyland, which was a product of people moving south and southwest in the United States to what are called Sun Belt states, and the car allowed them to get there. So in 1955, Disneyland opened in Southern California. 40% of the guests came by car. There's a picture of Disneyland on its opening day. Now, before I show you sort of what the kids did when the gates opened at the park, I want to mention the advent of another important invention, and this would be air conditioning, which came to the United States in the 1950s, and without air conditioning, I don't know that many people would want to be living in Southern California. It's just a little bit too hot. There are the kids. This is what Disneyland turned America into. Rushing to rides, trying to play with stuffed dogs. It's just, yeah, it is what it is. Anyways, interstates also facilitated the rise of the suburbs. So in 1949, a suburban builder named William Levitt produced 150 houses per week in towns like that pictured on the screen, where people could buy a house for roughly $8,000. This was a small amount in that time. It was easy. It was manageable, especially if you had a job. And people coming back from the war looked at this as a great opportunity. Now, if you notice, these places and places like this were had a bunch of houses that were exactly the same. They were cookie cutter homes. It has been said that some people that lived in these towns even got lost. They couldn't find their own house because it looked the same as all the rest of them. If you live in Rolling Meadows, you live in a planned community, a planned suburban area, which is why in Rolling Meadows all the streets are curved, whereas in Arlington Heights it's built on a grid pattern and sort of expanded as time went on, which is why all the Arlington Heights kids hate driving around in Rolling Meadows because it's too confusing and all those bird names. Now, suburban life made its way onto TV, and you saw shows like the Donna Reed Show, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, and the Ozzie and Harriet Show. Now, if you notice all of these TV shows, which were popular, they were primetime shows, they all have something in common. Take a minute. Can you tell what it is? It has to do with the color of the skin of all the people in these shows. Now, I like to talk about this one the most, Father Knows Best, because this was sort of an iconic image of the time, that families looked to the father as a patriarchal figure, and mom was really there, sort of held the family together, but if there was a question, it went to dad. Mom sort of played a subordinate role in that regard. Now, television is sort of the main new thing on the scene in the 1950s. 75% of American households had a TV by the end of the 1950s, and it said that most Americans spent 1/3 of their waking hours in front of the TV. That is just disgusting. TV continues to control America. As said by the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission in 1961, television is a vast wasteland, and it still kind of reigns true. But there are a lot of people who made a lot of money off of television, especially advertising agencies and companies that put their products on TV. So now that we've established the conformity that was going on in the 1950s, let's talk quickly about the non-conformists. The biggest group of non-conformists would have been known as the Beat generation, and the Beats or the Beatniks were young kids who defied the rules. So the most famous example of this is Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is a novel about how Jack Kerouac and his friends rode around the United States, went to different areas, did drugs, drank alcohol, wrote poems, and had sex. And that was everything that was going against the conformity or the expectations of most families during the 1950s. But this Beat generation is sort of looking for a way out, and they lay the groundwork for what's going to happen in the 1960s. Stay put for that. This teen culture that was emerging, and if you can hear in the background, there's some Elvis playing. The 1950s was the decade in which the word teenager was invented. It entered the American language, and it really gave young kids between the ages of 13 and 18 a role now. They didn't have a role in society before, but now that they're teenagers, they're forced to go to school, they're forced to follow all these rules, they become teens. They also go out and get summer jobs or jobs that they work during the school year, and by 1956, teenagers are worth about $7 billion to advertising agencies and companies who want to sell their stuff. One of the most important things that teenagers are willing to spend their money on is music, and rock and roll is the new music that jumps onto the scene. Now, parents, as you can imagine, were not happy with rock and roll because it has its roots in black culture, so all of these white parents in suburban America were scared that their kids would run off with black people because they were listening to rock and roll. Obviously, the most famous rock and roll person was Elvis, otherwise known as the King. Elvis came on the scene shaking his hips and, singing in a way that got a lot of attention, especially from the girls, and it made a lot of parents nervous that their kids would descend into chaos. Now, this teen culture breeded the possibility of becoming delinquent. So if you've ever heard of J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, it's a book that's about juvenile delinquency, and it was really a concern for many parents of the day. Marlon Brando and James Dean were two actors during the time period that played juvenile delinquents, and like I said, parents really were worried about this, that their teens would run off and become delinquents. Most of the time in white suburbia that didn't happen, but parents were still scared nevertheless. Now, my favorite lady in the 1950s is Betty Friedan, and Betty Friedan writes a book in 1963, but she gets her roots in the 1950s, and the 50s are really what make her angry, where she details the frustrating lives of the women in America. So she writes about how the women aren't happy being housewives, and they want a little bit more respect, and that husbands and children should allow women to break free and leave the home and enter the workplace. This book sends shock waves throughout a country that is heavily set in the mindset that the woman needs to stay at home and she is what holds a good family together. I'll give you a statistic. Many people think that if a woman goes to work, then her and her husband are going to get divorced, but I'll clue you into a little secret. In 1889, so 60 years before the 1950s, America had the highest divorce rate in the world, which means that if women are going to go to work, it's not going to make the divorce rate any worse. Nothing that we really have to be concerned about. Betty Friedan is by far one of my greatest heroes of the 1950s. Take that, Alex Resney. Okay, to continue with Betty Friedan, she becomes one of the founders of the National Organization of Women and its first president. She leads the fight for an equal rights amendment, which fails in the 1970s, but she is going to be a leading player on the stage for gender equality for decades to come. The 1950s also sees progress through science. For example, the first computer is created by the government and military in 1951. Duke University establishes the structure of DNA. Jonas Salk creates a vaccine for polio. And in 1957, the United States builds its first power plant. All of those things represent important innovations in science and speak to the sort of drive that many people in America are feeling during the 1950s. The limits are endless to a lot of folks in America. Now, not so happy, not so conformist, but the advent of the birth control pill in the 1950s and its implementation in the 1960s really opens up a Pandora's box when it comes to women being able to control their own bodies. Now, this progress through science leads to a lot of hoaxes, and many people claim that they start to see UFOs. And if you've ever heard of War of the Worlds or the radio broadcast saying that aliens are going to take over the world, it caught a lot of people by storm in the 1950s. They started to believe these things, that science was going to be the end of humanity. Now, these authors or these movie directors, they used aliens as sort of a metaphor for somebody else. Is there anybody you can think of to yourself that might have been penetrating American society in the 1950s, making it scary? Hopefully you're able to figure it out. If not, you can ask one of your friends. I'm sure that they've got it. Okay, to switch gears, we're going to start to talk about the 1950s and how it represents the seeds for the civil rights movement. So before we do that, I want to just review for a second. The civil rights movement had been happening for many years. Remember, slaves didn't like to be slaves and they resisted. Booker T. Washington and Du Bois in the early 1900s talked about how blacks weren't treated fairly. In the 1920s, blacks had themselves a Harlem Renaissance where they expressed themselves through art and poetry and things like that. And in 1941, A. Philip Randolph led a march on Washington. All of these things equate to Black Americans being disgruntled, being unhappy about their place in society. I don't want you to think that all of a sudden in the 1950s Black Americans decided to be angry. It was not the case. And what changes in the 1950s and why it can be considered the seeds of the modern civil rights movement is that Black Americans start to see progress. People start to listen to them a little bit more and start to take their advice to heart. So, first big event with regard to the civil rights in the 1950s is going to come by way of this guy, and because of this guy, largely, this is Thurgood Marshall. He's in your Henrietta reading packet. He's somebody who you should be acquainted with. He is responding to Executive Order 8802, which, if you recall, was an executive order passed by FDR that created the Fair Employment Practices Commission. It was not entirely successful. While it aimed to create equality in the workplace, it didn't entirely work. So Thurgood Marshall, who is the leader of the NAACP litigation fund, which means he's their head lawyer, seeks to change the focus of the civil rights movement from employment discrimination to ending segregation in public places, so like in schools and movie theaters and things like that. So he starts this in Topeka, Kansas with the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education. Here are the main people in this case. Linda Brown is the girl who wants to go to a white school. Thurgood Marshall becomes her lawyer, and Earl Warren is the chief judge of the Supreme Court that is going to hear this case. Here's some background, or here's the essential information for the case that you need to know. It was heard in 1954. The school board that was segregating their schools was in Topeka, Kansas. Linda Brown, who was a third grader, she was 9 years old, had to walk past a white school to go to her black school. She had to walk through a railroad switchyard, which isn't very safe. So she sued in order to go to the white school. It made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled in a majority opinion. This quote, and the most famous part of the majority opinion says, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." They continue by saying that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This overturns a very famous and influential Supreme Court case heard in 1896 that I am going to let you momentarily think about. Answer to yourself, and we'll move on. There is Leviticus in front of the Brown versus Board of Education historical site, and my wife and his mom, they're enjoying a day in front of the school that Linda Brown wanted to go to, and the school that was integrated after the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education ruled in favor of Linda Brown. Moving on, while people are trying to integrate public places, in Montgomery, Alabama, 1955, Rosa Parks and other civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. organized a bus boycott. To set the bus boycott off, Rosa Parks decides to sit on the bus, get arrested, which then kicks off the boycott. She did not just get tired. She did not just sit there. This was planned. The reason why I emphasize this is because I want you to know that civil rights leaders and black Americans have agency. Stuff does not just happen on accident. You get it done. We're going to make the world a better place. You need to understand that. This is the Rosa Parks bus. It's located in the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. You can actually sit in her seat. I have sat in the seat of Rosa Parks. I got up though. Now, eventually, the civil rights leaders are able to win the bus boycott in Montgomery, and all the buses are desegregated as a result of this organized event. Moving on, in the last of the major civil rights events in the 1950s, Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, as a result of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which said that all schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed. Which, let's take a minute and analyze that. What does that mean? All deliberate speed. Think to yourself. Is that vague or specific? How do you think southern states are going to react to all deliberate speed? That's right, they're going to go kind of slow. So in Little Rock Central High School, they were set to desegregate in 1957. 9 black students were going to enter this all-white high school. And in order to stop them, Governor Orville Faubus, which is just an evil name, stood in front of the door to make sure that they could not get in. The black students were turned away. In response to days of the black students being turned away, Dwight D. Eisenhower lets down his guard against civil rights and calls in the 101st Airborne to walk the kids to school. Now remember, Dwight D. Eisenhower was the leader of the American forces at D-Day. I don't know that the 101st Airborne should really be used to walk kids to school in America. Now, in response, because the kids were able to go to school after the 101st Airborne intervenes, the governor closes the schools the next year. Because this is America. There's a sign, Little Rock Central High School was closed, not by order of the federal government, by order of the state government, but I think that they're kind of poking fun at the federal government there. The governor closed the schools to keep the black kids out. This is sickening. Here are the people associated with the Little Rock Nine that you need to know. There's the evil bastard right there, Orville Faubus. There's less evil, but still kind of evil, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And this is the most iconic image from the Little Rock Nine controversy. This is Elizabeth Eckford, a black student who missed the caravan to school one day. And this is Hazel Massery, who is screaming at her in the background. Not really all that fun. Okay, so the sparks of the civil rights movement that occurred in the 1950s were the Brown versus Board of Education case, the murder of Emmett Till, which you should have watched a video on assigned to you last class, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and the integration of Little Rock Central High School. How well did it go? Think to yourself. Well, if the civil rights movement is still going on in the 1960s and the 1970s in Ferguson, Missouri, that should be a hint to you. I want to close by talking about the 1950s and their legacy. There's a very influential book called The Way We Never Were by Stephanie Coontz, which has one of the greatest subtitles I've ever read, called American Families and the Nostalgia Trap. There is a picture from Leave It to Beaver on the front of this book. Notice that the common American family, 2 kids, dad in a suit, mom stays at home, no black people anywhere. People in America look back at the 1950s with what is called nostalgia. Nostalgia is the action of looking back at certain times in history, wishing that we could go back to them because they were better. I have constantly heard people say, usually people who are between the ages of 40 and 50, say that we need to go back to the good old days, the old-timey times. And usually they mean the 1950s, when life was just better. There wasn't fighting, there wasn't anger, the government left you alone, all of those things. Lies. Remember, the whole reason we have suburbs is because of the federal government. Don't ever remember that. People who say that everybody in the 1950s stood on their own 2 feet, not the case. The government did things for them. Here are some 1950s statistics that might shed some light on just how nostalgic that decade was. 10% of girls between the ages of 15 and 19, so most of you listening are between that age, were pregnant during the 1950s. 10%. That's insane. Tranquilizer use by women doubled between 1958 and 1959. If women are taking tranquilizers, what does that tell you about their happiness? Were women really happy to be stay-at-home moms? Think about it. And despite all these newfangled devices like washing machines and dishwashers and refrigerators, women spent more time in the home doing work. Because all those devices did was free them up to do more. So I want you to ask yourself, how should we remember the 1950s?